Welcome to the deep dive. We have a massive stack of sources to get through today, and well, I am incredibly glad you are here with us.
Yeah, we've got a lot of ground to cover.
We really do. And you are the essential third person in this conversation. We're going to need your perspective because today's topic, it actually affects almost every facet of your daily life.
It definitely does.
On the surface, our sources look completely unrelated. We are looking at a pretty brutal app analytics report from the Tech Buzz, a breaking legal dispatch from PBS News.
That one is fascinating.
Yeah, it's wild. Plus, the incredibly dense February 2026 employment situation report straight from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and a CBS News feature detailing some wild leadership shakeups over at the FDA.
Right, they seem disconnected at first glance.
Exactly. But our mission today is to look at the friction connecting all of this. We are exploring the tension between massive, seemingly untouchable institutions and the everyday people they serve. We're going to look at the mechanics of what happens when consumers, fans, workers, and patients finally push back against the systems that govern them.
It's a brilliant stack of reading. And while you are right that they span tech, entertainment, economics, and healthcare, the through line is unmistakable. They all reveal a shifting power dynamic in 2026. Across the board, we're seeing everyday individuals realizing the mechanics of their collective leverage and, well, they're forcing these massive entities to react in real time.
And nowhere is that leverage more visible or faster than on your smartphone. Let's start with this data from the Tech Buzz. They are reporting that ChatGPT uninstalls have skyrocketed by 295%.
That is a staggering number.
People are actively deleting the app in droves. When you see a mass exodus like this, okay, let's unpack this. Because the trigger was OpenAI formally announcing a controversial new partnership with the Department of Defense. They stepped into the military contracting space, and the consumer base immediately rebelled.
Right, and if you look at the timeline, what's fascinating here is the sheer speed of the reaction. The analytics platforms registered this massive spike in uninstalls within hours of the Pentagon partnership being confirmed.
Hours. Not days, hours.
Exactly. It is a profound shift in consumer behavior. You have millions of people who know exactly what ChatGPT is and have integrated it into their daily workflows, drafting emails, writing code, summarizing meetings, and suddenly they drew a hard ethical line.
They just cut it off.
They decided they wanted absolutely nothing to do with a tool that is concurrently serving military applications. It shows that for a very specific, highly engaged chunk of the user base, defense contracts come with severe brand toxicity.
But let's look at the mechanics of why OpenAI is doing this in the first place. I mean, they aren't pivoting to defense contracts just for fun. Training and running these massive frontier models requires an unbelievable amount of compute power.
The overhead is astronomical.
It is. They are burning through billions of dollars, and eventually, venture capital dries up. The Pentagon is one of the only entities on Earth with deep enough pockets to fund the scale OpenAI is chasing.
That is the core business dilemma. On one hand, you have the raw economics. The defense intelligence budgets completely dwarf the revenue generated from standard $20 a month consumer subscriptions. The enterprise and government contracts are where the actual survival money is.
Right, it's survival.
But on the other hand, you have market share realities. As the TechBuzz piece points out, switching costs in the AI space are essentially zero. Every AI assistant lives exactly one App Store search away. There is no deeply entrenched ecosystem lock-in like you have with Apple's iOS or Google's suite of products.
Which means the second users delete OpenAI, they just download a competitor. And the immediate beneficiary here is Anthropic's Claude. The data shows users migrating straight to Claude, largely because Anthropic has spent the last 2 years marketing their constitutional AI principles.
Right, and to understand why that is such a magnet right now, we have to look at what constitutional AI actually means in practice. Anthropic essentially gives their AI a strict foundational rulebook, think of it like the UN Declaration of Human Rights, that the underlying system cannot violate.
It's hard-coded into the model.
Yes. It is hard-coded to avoid lethal applications or assisting in physical harm. That specific positioning was always viewed as a bit of a marketing gimmick by some in the Valley, but suddenly it is acting as a massive competitive advantage for disillusioned OpenAI users.
So the takeaway for you, the user, is that the tools you rely on daily are changing allegiances behind the scenes. The compute required to process every prompt you type might be subsidized by an ecosystem that is pivoting toward military applications. But as we are seeing with this 295% spike in uninstalls, the power actually sits with the consumer.
Absolutely.
You can literally vote with your thumbs, and ethical concerns are now driving measurable switching behavior in the tech sector.
It puts every tech company on notice. Chasing those massive defense dollars carries a quantifiable cost to your consumer base.
That idea of feeling trapped in an ecosystem or trying to fight back against a massive platform, it doesn't just apply to the software on our phones. It is exactly how music and sports fans have been feeling about buying live event tickets, and that friction is reaching a boiling point in the courts right now.
The Live Nation case.
Yes, we have a breaking news report from PBS about the Justice Department and Live Nation, the parent company of Ticketmaster. The DOJ just reached a tentative antitrust settlement.
The trial itself was supposed to be the main event. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the drama surrounding this last-minute settlement is arguably bigger than the settlement itself.
Let's look at the terms they agreed to. Live Nation would pay a fine of up to $280 million. They would have to divest at least 13 amphitheaters across the country, and they have to open up their ticketing processes so competitors can theoretically share in the sale of tickets.
A lot of promises there.
Yeah, and a senior DOJ official anonymously called this deal a win-win for everybody, claiming it brings immediate relief for consumers. But frankly, if you are Live Nation, a $280 million fine seems like a drop in the bucket for a company of that size.
Which is exactly why the pushback has been so severe. Judge Arun Subramanian, a federal judge in Manhattan overseeing the trial, called the late notice of this tentative deal entirely unacceptable.
Because they were already moving forward.
Exactly. The jury was already seated, opening statements had happened, and suddenly the federal government tries to wrap it up with a fine and a minor divestment. But the real friction is coming from the states. A bipartisan coalition led by states like New York, Washington, and Texas is flat out rejecting the deal.
I remember trying to get Bruce Springsteen tickets a while back. I was stuck in a digital waiting room for 2 hours, watching the dynamic pricing surge, only to finally get through and see that the mandatory platform fees literally doubled the base price of the ticket. Fans know exactly what this monopoly feels like, and the states are channeling that frustration.
They really are.
New York Attorney General Letitia James released a statement saying this Justice Department deal, quote, fails to address the monopoly at the center of this case. They are refusing to sign on. They want a full trial.
You'll understand the state's legal strategy here. You have to look at the flywheel effect of Live Nation's corporate structure. The states allege that Live Nation uses threats, retaliation, and exclusive long-term contracts to suffocate competition.
Because they control every step of the process.
Precisely. Because they own the venues, promote the tours, and control the exclusive ticketing platform, competitors simply cannot get a foothold. The states argue that fining them $280 million and taking away 13 venues does not break the flywheel.
It is a fundamental divide in antitrust philosophy.
Exactly. You have the federal government taking a highly pragmatic approach. They look at a settlement as a tangible, immediate victory that gets some level of competition back into the market tomorrow, avoiding the massive risk and years-long delay of a prolonged trial and inevitable appeals.
Right.
But you have the states taking an idealistic, structuralist approach. For the states, leaving the core corporate structure of Live Nation intact is a complete failure of antitrust enforcement. They want to dismantle the company into separate pieces in open court.
The federal government thinks they just extracted a penalty, and the states are saying the penalty is just the cost of doing business for a fundamentally broken system. And the fans, and the artists for that matter, are stuck in the middle, waiting to see if they'll ever have a choice in how they buy a concert ticket.
It is a perfect illustration of our theme today. The friction between consumer outrage and corporate control has culminated in a fractured legal battle where even the government regulators cannot agree on what justice looks like.
Okay, let's shift to gears from the economics of live entertainment to the literal economy and look at how worker friction is actually altering federal data. We are moving to our third source, the official February 2026 Employment Situation Report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
The BLS report is always a heavy read.
It is, and at first glance, the headline numbers look like a red flag. Total non-farm payroll employment edged down by 92,000 jobs in February. Meanwhile, the overall unemployment rate is sitting at 4.4%, which represents about 7.6 million people out of work.
Whenever payrolls contract, it triggers an immediate panic on financial news networks. But the headline number is just a surface-level indicator. The underlying mechanics of the BLS report tell a much more complex story about structural economic changes and work and leverage.
Those headline numbers always trigger a panic. But if you look at the underlying data, here's where it gets really interesting, because a huge chunk of that 92,000 job drop comes specifically from the healthcare sector. Healthcare employment declined by 28,000 jobs, and specifically, offices of physicians lost 37,000 jobs in February.
And that wasn't random.
No, the report explicitly notes this wasn't due to doctors going out of business or a lack of patient demand. It was primarily due to strike activity.
That is a remarkable detail.
Yeah.
Workers actively walking off the job, utilizing their collective leverage, literally moved the national macroeconomic needle into negative territory for the month. It wasn't a recessionary contraction, it was a labor dispute showing up in the federal data.
But there are actual structural contractions happening elsewhere in the report. The information sector continues to bleed, trending down an average of 5,000 jobs a month over the prior 12 months. And federal government employment is seeing a massive shift. Since its peak in October 2024, federal government employment is down by 11%. That is 330,000 government jobs gone.
And yet, amidst all that shifting and sector contraction, the data shows that average hourly earnings for all private non-farm employees are actually up 3.8% over the past year. Wages are still growing, which contradicts the simple narrative of a shrinking economy.
Okay, we need to dive into the data nerd details of this report because it explains so much about how statistics shape our perception of reality. The BLS incorporated updated population estimates into this February report. They finally integrated the 2020 census data, which was delayed by the 2025 government shutdown, and the new demographic math completely shifts the baselines.
This is crucial to understand. The BLS doesn't just count every single job. They use surveys and extrapolate based on population controls. When they updated those controls with the 2020 census data, the math revealed structural demographic changes. The new base showed fewer men aged 25 to 54 and significantly more women over the age of 65.
Right, and that changes the denominator for everything. Because prime-age men typically have much higher labor force participation rates, and older demographics generally have lower participation rates, this reality check mathematically put downward pressure on the overall labor force participation rate. It is now sitting at 62%.
Which is why you have to look past the headlines. When a news anchor screams the labor force is shrinking or jobs are disappearing, the reality on the ground might simply be a temporary healthcare strike in physician offices combined with a long overdue demographic adjustment reflecting an aging population.
It totally changes the narrative.
It does. Understanding the mechanics behind these numbers makes you a significantly smarter consumer of economic news. The data isn't always what it seems.
Speaking of federal data and the complexities of the healthcare industry, that brings us perfectly to our final source, a dispatch from CBS News regarding some intense friction over at the Food and Drug Administration. Dr. Vinay Prasad, the embattled FDA vaccine chief who was brought in under the Trump administration, is leaving the agency at the end of April to return to his academic post at UCSF. And to say his tenure was a roller coaster would be an understatement.
The CBS report notes this is actually the second time he has departed the agency in less than a year. He was briefly forced out last July after aggressively clashing with biotech executives and patient advocacy groups, only to be reinstated shortly after with the backing of Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and FDA Commissioner Marty Meschery.
The controversies have been nonstop, and they center entirely around how strictly the government should regulate cutting-edge medicine. The article highlights two wild clashes. First, Prasad initially refused to allow the FDA to even review a highly anticipated flu vaccine from Moderna. This wasn't a standard flu shot, it was built on mRNA technology.
That was a huge deal in the industry.
Huge. It was a highly unusual rejection that prompted Moderna to go public with their complaints. And a week later, the FDA actually reversed course and accepted the shot for review, pending an additional study.
The friction there stems from the nature of mRNA itself. Traditional vaccines are single, static products. But mRNA is essentially a platform technology. It is a delivery mechanism that can be quickly recoded for different strains. Regulators are struggling with how to properly evaluate a platform that is designed to change rapidly versus demanding years of static clinical trials for every minor iteration.
But the second clash highlighted in the report is even more intense. It is a fight between the FDA and a smaller drug company called Unicor over their experimental gene therapy for Huntington's disease. Huntington's is a brutal, fatal condition affecting about 40,000 people in the U.S. Unicor developed a gene therapy, but because of the blood-brain barrier, it has to be injected directly into the brain during a highly invasive surgical procedure.
When you are dealing with irreversible genetic editing, this raises an important question about the boundaries of medical regulation. The FDA, under Prasad, demanded a new clinical trial that would require some patients in the control group to undergo a sham surgery to prove the drug actually works.
Wait, hold on. The FDA is actively demanding that people undergo fake brain surgery. They want surgeons to drill into someone's skull just to inject a placebo. Isn't that a massive violation of medical ethics?
I know it sounds medieval, but from a purely scientific and historical standpoint, the FDA's rationale is rooted in data integrity. The placebo effect in neurological surgery is incredibly powerful. Historically, there have been trials for Parkinson's disease where patients received fake surgeries, literally having burr holes drilled into their skulls without receiving the actual therapy. And those patients showed remarkable, measurable improvements in their motor functions simply because they believed they had been treated.
That's incredible. But the risks are so high.
They are. If the FDA approves a highly invasive, incredibly expensive gene therapy without a sham surgery control, they risk approving a useless procedure that subjects future patients to the immense dangers of brain surgery for zero actual biological benefit.
The rhetoric coming out of the FDA reflects that exact strictness. An anonymous senior FDA official spoke to CBS reporters, which is highly unusual for the agency to do, and called Unicure's original study, quote, stone cold negative. The official flat out said, we have a failed product here.
And that set off the advocacy groups.
Completely. You have Unicore executives and patient advocacy groups pushing back incredibly hard. They argue that demanding a sham brain surgery contradicts previous FDA guidance. They are saying it is needlessly cruel to ask desperate patients facing a fatal decline to risk a surgical placebo, all while adding years and millions of dollars to the development timeline.
It is the ultimate regulatory tightrope. You have a federal regulator acting as an uncompromising gatekeeper, demanding arguably unorthodox proof of efficacy to protect the public from useless, dangerous procedures. And on the flip side, you have pharmaceutical innovators and desperate patients arguing that these moving target demands are fundamentally unethical when dealing with a terminal illness.
This bureaucratic infighting, these debates over sham surgeries and mRNA platform reviews, they directly dictate what eventually makes it to your local hospital. The safety, the availability, and the cost of the medicine you might one day rely on is being hammered out in these exact clashes. It is friction with literally life or death stakes.
Which perfectly encapsulates the underlying theme of all our sources today.
It really does. When you zoom out and look at these four distinct stories, you have to ask, so what does this all mean for the everyday person? We started by looking at consumers realizing their leverage and mass deleting ChatGPT because they refuse to let their daily workflows fund military defense contracts. We looked at a bipartisan coalition of states rejecting a pragmatic federal settlement, demanding a full trial to completely dismantle a live entertainment ticketing monopoly. We explored how a national drop in job numbers wasn't a recession, but rather a reflection of thousands of healthcare workers utilizing their power to strike, alongside complex demographic math. And finally, we saw the intense ethical battles inside the FDA where regulators and biotech companies are fighting over what constitutes proof when regulating complex gene therapies for fatal diseases. In every single corner of society, the people at the bottom are finding ways to push back on the systems at the top.
And if we follow these threads to their logical conclusion, we arrive at a rather profound collision. We discussed how AI companies are increasingly pivoting toward massive government and defense contracts to fund the billions in compute power they need to survive. We just discussed how the FDA is struggling to rapidly but safely regulate incredibly complex data-heavy biotech like mRNA and genetic sequencing. What happens when these two rapidly evolving worlds merge? Imagine a near future where the artificial intelligence models processing our clinical trials, analyzing our genetic data, and shaping public health policy are the very same foundational models funded by and intertwined with military defense budgets. When the algorithms deciding the efficacy of your healthcare are built by defense contractors, who exactly draws the ethical lines?
Wow. That is an incredibly heavy question to ponder. The overlap between massive defense computing and deeply personal healthcare regulation is something we are all going to have to navigate very soon. I want you to take that thought with you into your week. Keep questioning the mechanics behind the data you see, keep looking for the friction behind the headlines, and remember that whether it's the app on your phone, the tickets you buy, or the data defining your economy, you have more leverage in these systems than you might think. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We will catch you next time.